Okay, let's jump right into this. Welcome to this explainer on the Hagia Sophia. Today, we're going to unpack a pretty wild historical paradox. You see, there's a massive, almost unbelievable contrast between the heavenly, floating aesthetic of this iconic building and its actual, harrowing, 1,500-year structural reality. So we're going to look past all that beautiful marble and shimmering gold to see what is literally holding this monumental structure together.
Put yourself in the 6th century for a second. You're surrounded by this heavy, massive stone architecture. You walk inside, you look up, and you see this gigantic, soaring dome that just defies gravity. How in the world do you make thousands of tons of brick and mortar look like they're just floating on thin air? It's physically impossible, right? Well, yeah. Yet, that is exactly the optical illusion the builders of the Hagia Sophia somehow managed to pull off, capturing the imagination of everyone who walked through its doors. And just to show you how well this illusion worked, listen to this quote. It's from Procopius, who was a really prominent 6th century Byzantine historian. He wrote this absolutely glowing, almost otherworldly review of Emperor Justinian's big architectural project. To him, and honestly to the whole Byzantine public, the Hagia Sophia didn't look like a product of human engineering. No way. It looked like a literal miracle, a dome suspended by a golden chain straight out of heaven.
That brings us to part one, a vision of holy wisdom. Let's dig into the very intentional design choices that created this mystical illusion in the first place. Because you know that miracle Procopius was raving about? It was totally calculated. Procopius wasn't just casually jotting down notes on a new building. He was using a very specific literary trick called ekphrasis. It's basically a highly vivid rhetorical description meant to paint a vivid picture right in the listener's mind. So he was essentially acting as the PR arm of the Byzantine Empire. His writings weren't objective reviews. They were carefully crafted propaganda meant to push a narrative of divine intervention and supreme imperial power. It was all about deliberately masking the earthly nuts and bolts mechanics of the building. Moving on to part two, designing heavenly light. Let's look at the actual math and science the architects used to back up all that divine propaganda, because it definitely wasn't magic. The architects behind this, Anthemios and Sidoros, weren't your average builders. The Byzantines called them mechanikoi, meaning they were deeply educated in math and optical sciences. Get this. They aligned the entire longitudinal axis of the Hagia Sophia perfectly with the sunrise on the winter solstice. That is absolutely not an accident. They intentionally used ancient astronomical computations to capture the absolute best natural light possible. They literally designed this building as a giant light-capturing machine to make the space feel incredibly sacred and symbolic. And the results of that calculated lighting? Pure theater. Procopius went full ekphrasis again, comparing the sunlight hitting all those multicolored marbles to a meadow with its flowers in full bloom. He describes being totally mesmerized by the purple, green, crimson, and white flashes bouncing off the stone and the gold mosaics. This optical effect completely overwhelmed the senses of the viewer. It essentially hid the structural bones of the building behind this blinding, beautiful glare.
But here's the massive plot twist for this explainer. Let's strip away that 6th century PR for a minute. When we put the Byzantine illusion side by side with physical reality, wow, it is a very different story. While Procopius is out here claiming perfect harmony and a dome suspended by God, the reality is a building plagued by asymmetrical main piers, mismatched arcades, and massive, terrifying shear forces. The truth? The Hagia Sophia was, and honestly still is, a deeply flawed engineering project. Let's get into the nitty-gritty in part 3, the structural nightmare. We're going to leave the poetry behind and look at how this nightmare builds up right from the ground floor. When you look at the floor plan, focus on those red areas. Those are the 4 main piers that have to hold up the colossal weight of the dome above. And notice anything? They aren't perfectly uniform. They have these asymmetric edges going in multiple directions. Now, if you know anything about structural engineering, especially in an earthquake-prone zone like Istanbul, you know you want your load-bearing supports to handle horizontal forces evenly. Because these piers are asymmetric, they really struggle to unify under stress, which severely compromises the entire building's earthquake resistance.
And the problems don't stop at the piers. Check out the cross-section, specifically those vertical red lines. There is a totally fatal numerical mismatch happening here. On the ground floor, right between the main buttresses, you have an arrangement of 5 arcades. But step up to the gallery floor right above it, suddenly it's a pattern of 7 arcades. Because the column sizes and numbers don't match up between the floors, the vertical load transferring down from that insanely heavy dome is totally disrupted. It transfers unevenly, placing immense unequal stress all over the building's walls.
So, what happens when your foundation is this flawed? Absolute catastrophe. Just 21 years after the church opened, following a series of earthquakes, the original main dome completely collapsed in 558 AD. The inadequate curve of the dome and those deformed main pillars just gave up. And sadly, it wasn't a one-time thing. This building has essentially been forced into a constant state of peril, suffering massive partial collapses again in 989 AD and 1346 AD.
Which leads us to part 4, centuries of interventions. This is the story of a desperate, multi-generational rescue mission to keep the Hagia Sophia standing. Since they couldn't just rebuild the flawed piers without tearing the whole church down, generations of architects had to improvise exterior life support. It's kind of like a structural baton being passed across time. After the 10th century collapse, the famous Armenian architect Tridat stepped in to rebuild the dome ribs. Fast forward to the 14th century, builders are literally attaching Gothic flying buttresses from 4 different directions just to prop it up. In the 19th century, the Fossati brothers bring in industrial era fixes. And today, modern engineers are proposing advanced tension rings. It has literally been a 1,500-year battle against gravity.
And speaking of the Fossati brothers, this is an incredible reveal. During their massive restorations in the late 1840s, they made a really radical move. They actually took down those 14th century flying buttresses that had held the dome up for 500 years. Instead, they forged an iron frame, basically a giant chain of iron beams, and hid it right under the plaster around the base of the dome to hold the perimeter together. They gave the building a hidden iron corset. It was a total secret to the naked eye for over a century, and only recently exposed when some surface plaster chipped away. Crazy, right? So, we're left with a really profound question to wrap up this explainer. We started with Procopius swearing this was a perfect, divine creation suspended straight from heaven. But now that we've seen the blueprints, the asymmetric piers, the structural collapses, and the hidden iron chains, if a building requires 1,500 years of constant structural life support to stay upright, is its true genius found in that flawed, daring original design? Or does the real marvel lie in the countless generations of engineers and architects who just absolutely refuse to let it fall? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Hagia Sophia.